Hi, I'm Dawn Marisa Lays with INIS 2022 Neurodiversity Conference, and I am here with C.A.Watts, who is from Australia and does some of the coolest, most interesting thinking that's just so right up my alley. And I'm really excited to be talking with her. She is a teacher and an academic and currently a PhD candidate. She's got like forensics and psychology and criminology and all kinds of cool freaking stuff in her being. And one of the things that just got me so excited when I was starting to get to know her is that she has done this research about the intersectionality of the queer community, of which I am a member, the queer community and neurodivergent community. And that's what we are going to talk about right now. And Courtney, thank you so much for being willing to share your thoughts on this topic.
I'm glad I was able to have something that got you so interested. You were very excited when I pitched that idea as a talk topic.
Oh yeah, I have taken on the persona of Winnie the Pooh's Tigger almost my entire life, you know, bouncy flouncy and all of that. I get very happy, very excited when I see ideas that resonate and make sense and have usefulness. And that's what I saw in your research, that it wasn't just interesting ideas, it had validity and value for the community that, you know, I belong to, the neurodivergent community, but this community that I'm trying so hard to benefit.
No, so can completely understandable. To be fair, or frank, I should say, a lot of my research that I'm investigating is the whys. A lot of the queer intersectionality research is quite solid already. So when it comes to the current state of things, I'm really building from that as opposed to exploring a new idea entirely. The idea of queer intersectionality certainly isn't new.
So what drew you to the topic?
It's too important. There's so many connections between the neurodivergent community and the queer community that it's not possible to learn about one without the other. You're not getting the whole picture if you do that. We have a shared history, a lot of shared experiences that bind us. And given the high occurrence of the crossover between the queer community and the neurodivergent community, you need to know both stories. You need to know both histories. You need to know information about the social experiences of both communities if you are studying one, because if you are around neurodivergent people, you are going to be around queer people. If you're around queer people, you are going to be around neurodivergent people. And without the understanding of the other community, you're flying blind. You don't have enough information. And so if you're a doctor, a teacher, any form of clinician, a therapist, then you need to make sure you know both if you're working with one of these communities, because by definition, you're going to be working with both.
So because I got so happy and excited, I've been telling a bunch of different people I'm going to be talking to C.A.Watts, and we're going to be talking about intersectionality. And almost everybody I talked to, one of their first, you know, after, wow, that's so cool, was this little moment of terror. How will that get used against us? Did you find, as you were looking at these topics, that either that fear was there or maybe there was some valid reason for that fear?
I personally didn't experience any fear exploring the topic because when it comes to the topics I explore, it's a journey of self-discovery for me. So I make a point of staying in my lane, as it were. The intersectionality that I talk about, that I write about, that I study is specific to myself, and I use how I do that as a means to boost other intersectionalities, to explain why exploring intersectional identity is important to be able to understand the whole person and provide holistic care to individual people, and then use that as a means to, this is why you need to go and find Black autistics. This is why you need to go and find Jewish autistics. This is why you need to go and find like all of these different intersections that I'm not a part of. My lane is queer intersectionality. And I also do make a point of nothing I promote or advocate for is ever a personal opinion. I build the knowledge that I have based on the collective wisdom of the queer and autistic communities. If you are neurodivergent and having an opinion on various neurodivergent conditions, I'm taking in all of that information, and that goes for the queer communities also. So no piece of information from any sort of lived experience is disregarded. I'm taking it all. And so when I'm discussing the things that the information that I have, it's coming from a collective voice. It's coming from a variety of different places. I'm not simply here spruiking my own opinion. I'm not sure how that would go towards alleviating any fear of others. But for me, this is exciting. I mean, you've definitely ignited a bit of fear now because now I'm considering that there may very well be negative backlash, but from what we have seen with the push towards queer rights and how that original fight is now being used as a way to fight for autistic rights, again, because of our collective shared history, then if anything, I feel like each side is boosting the other. So while we are using our queer histories to push for generalization towards the neurodivergent community also, that should automatically feed back as well.
I hope so. And I'm thinking that possibly one of the reasons why these thoughts hadn't been so front of thought for you, it may just be the difference in where we live. I'm in the United States, you're in Australia. You may have a different experience there than many people in the United States do. Though we have a lot of freedoms and rights, equity and equality are still deep struggles here. And it doesn't really matter who you are. We're still deeply struggling with racial divides. We're still deeply struggling with even acknowledgement of autism in an appropriate way, let alone the LGBTQI plus community. We're just, as a nation, we're just really not good yet at being inclusive, at being accommodating, at being in love with our diversity.
There's definitely similarities here as well. Australia does tend to follow the US culturally quite closely. We have definitely our own racial concerns here, Black deaths in custody, and similar police brutality issues here. As a teacher, being autistic in schools can be incredibly hit and miss. I did a piece written on the Department of Education's Yammer page that I run, the Neurodivergent network for neurodivergent teachers to connect and share their experiences, as well as allow others in to get a look in as to what it is to be a neurodivergent teacher in institutions. And it was about all of this praise that I received because I did a lesson on the menstrual cycle for year 7, and they said that how I did that lesson to be so engaging and fun and light and fluffy, so they weren't bogged down by the seriousness of the issue, was so commendable. And how could I do that? I'm like, I'm autistic. I let myself out. This is what a natural person being who they are looks like. And if you all stopped getting stuck on the appearance of professionalism and actually let your own lived experiences shine through, and you made the teaching profession far more accessible and accommodating and welcoming to neurodivergent teachers, you'd have far more of this in the industry. Like, I'm not doing anything special here, I'm just existing. And that it was so far different, so much different to what is expected of teachers in this day and age. Like, you expect to be almost on a pedestal of perfection. You everything about yourself stays at home. Your work sonar stays rock solid, and you are dressed to perfection. You don't let any mistakes slip through. You are not the flawed average human being. You actually are. You present someone very different, but kids can tell, and to them it's disingenuous, and just like that, you've already lost the ability to teach them anything because they don't want to engage with anyone they don't trust. And some teachers that I was aware of who are autistic, ADHD, didn't get their contracts renewed for next year, despite the expertise that they had brought into their classrooms in favor of someone who was able to sell themselves better on paper. And it's just another way that we're essentially used for our emotional labor and the expertise that we have just to be discarded because we're too difficult.
Oh, I'm going to have to stay on topic, but that's a whole world. I started as a teacher and I left teaching because who I am and how I wanted to help my students was not appreciated. I wanted to be me for real in the classroom, and I wanted to help my kids learn how to be them for real. And yeah, too many demands for, why are you allowing those conversations, and why are you talking to the parents about things that you should have talked to us first about? And that was just weird to me. No, that's the parent's child, not your child. So I'm going to talk to the parent and I'll tell you how it went, right? So I couldn't do it. So I became a coach. So yeah, everything you're saying lights a new fire in me, and someday we should get on and we should talk about education and teaching and reality and all of those things.
Definitely. It is very hit and miss. Like, it always depends on where you are. Like, the school I'm at now, the head teacher of support asked me for my opinion on anxiety among our boys today. And we have a Pride advisor at this school. There is a Pride club held every week. Last year, half of the captain's speeches for this year's captains and vice captains of the school were all members of the Pride club. And it changed the entire feel and vibe and culture of the school. And when a principal has the power and the authority to make that decision himself and follows through on that and really stands behind it in a meaningful way, it changes everything. The person at the top can change everything for those below them. And that's why we need strong leadership when it comes to change for our queer kids.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, and equally so for the neurodivergent community, which, as we know, we populate each other's worlds. What was the main goal of the intersectionality research that you did?
Well, currently we know that that intersection is there. We know it's strong. At this point, it's we've found, I think maybe trans people are between 3 and 6 times more likely to be autistic. The last stats that I read was something ridiculous, like that Venn diagram is almost a circle. It's like roughly 70% crossover between the neurodivergent and queer communities. So anyone that is not cisgender and heterosexual, and anyone that is not neurotypical. So that's a giant population crossover. And while we know that relationship is there, there's so far only been speculation as to why. And so that's what I was planning on exploring myself. But it all comes down to the ability to really explore a lot of intimate issues that are not the easiest to find people who are willing to share. A lot of us are coming from traumatized backgrounds. The older we get, the more likely that is to be the case. So at this point, I do have quite a lot of speculation, but it's not something I've put into practice to be exploring at this immediate moment. I'm still just compiling all of the data that we already have.
So, I mean, probably any of us who have thought about this particular topic has their own theory in the why category. And again, since meeting you, I've tried to have a ton of these conversations. Why do you think it is? Why do you think it is? Because, most of the, by far, most of the neurodivergent people that I know, at least have an openness of thought when it comes to sexuality and gender, even if they're not currently self-identifying, they seem to have a more open thought to those ideas and ways of being. For me, I have very early childhood memories of complete and utter rejection of gender binary. Basically anything that puts somebody in a confined identity space. And so as I learn more and more about neurodivergence and those of us with that identity, the more I think that's fairly common. We don't enjoy limits. Now, autistic people may like predictability, they may like pattern, but they don't want that to be confining and narrow. This is a broad generalization, right? There are obviously people out there that would only like one choice, if anything, ever. Leave me alone with all of your variety, right? But I think there's this tendency in the neurodivergent community, especially if you've got folks who are autistic and ADHD, or autistic and some other neurotype. I think that idea of limiting or only one way of being just flies in the face of who we are. It's so antagonistic to our own inner being that I don't think we're interested either consciously or subconsciously in participating in that. So I think we tend to be more open to another human being without all the rules attached, right? So it's who I'm attracted to as a human more than who I'm attracted to in terms of their body parts. So that's my theory out there. And can you talk back to me about whether that has any resonance or no, John Murray, go back to your thinking chalkboard? Like,
I definitely think that it ties into the inability or disinterest or even outward rejection of the current social structures of the world. Social norms impact neurotypical acceptance of things. Is this going to tie into the world order? Is that going to be beneficial for me in that world order, or is it not? And if it's not going to be, what's the cost benefit ratio here? Is it eventually going to be worth it to me in the long run to lose out in the short term? It's those social structures rule everything. And so the games that we play in the workplace, in society, in our families to maintain the social structures and social reputations, they'll play whatever games necessary and learn whatever games necessary to maintain that structure and their place in it, while we're just standing there on the outside, like eating an ice block, watching the toddler axe themselves on a skateboard. Like, well, that didn't get you very far down, did it? So given that queer people are everywhere, I believe that there is just as many queer people in the neurotypical population than there is in the neurodivergent community. I just think that due to our disinterest in engaging in those social systems, that we're more likely to recognize it, accept it, and own it at a younger age, and be more open about it. Everything socially that we're experiencing from even the youngest of ages in both explicit and implicit messages sends the message that anything outside the norm is not okay. You should hide that. You should keep it behind closed doors. And as a result, people, neurotypical people, if they're then faced with those thoughts that they may be deviating from the norm, then they're more likely to be in denial about it, ignore it, brush it aside, while we're not. It wasn't even something that ever even crossed my mind. Like it made no difference to me. And not only that, given that neurodivergents are already targeted as it is, it's like, well, what's hiding being queer gonna do? Like, and if we're being targeted for a cross-section of those identities, then either way, the experience of being targeted is still there for one reason or another. So either way, to a young kid who doesn't have the terminology to explain it, or the ability to articulate what those thoughts and feelings are to the point where people in their life realize, oh, this kid's not straight, or this kid is not a cisgender child, all that child can articulate to themselves is, I'm being targeted because I'm different. And well, different is different. Because we're more likely to miss a lot of the implicit messages, and we do tend to rebel against the norms just because they are being pushed on us, then implicit messages are more likely to go over our heads, while the explicit messages are more likely to be outwardly rejected. Because if there's anything that autistics can agree on, it's that things need to make sense. And the idea that a queer person is wrong because society says so doesn't make sense. And so it's not an idea that from a neurodivergent perspective is going to resonate with a lot of us, because things need to make sense, particularly to autistics. And if they don't, well, then they're more likely to be rejected.
Yeah, that's definitely my lived experience. so many of the sort of arguments that I would have with my parents growing up were about the does it make sense test every time they taught me a new rule or how to be polite, or I was definitely the why child. If you tell me something, I was asking why, and that followed me. It follows me to this day, and I have learned to embrace it as a really beautiful and necessary part of my being, because much of what allowed harm in my life was compliance with things that didn't make sense. When I tried to follow a social rule or for a time, a religious rule or something like that, that in my heart of hearts was not valid for me, but I was going along with it. That's when I was open to behaviors from others that were harmful to me. And that's where I was the most self-deprecating and mentally self-harming of myself, was when I was complying with things that didn't make sense. And I definitely am finding the more I get into the knowledge of the neurodivergent community, the actual people living their life, the more I hear those kinds of stories. Well, I was trying to do what I thought was the right thing. I was trying to, every time we try to fit in, every time we try to be what we think people are telling us to be, that's when we're open to harm. And I think that's a space where the queer community also finds a lot of its trauma, when they don't feel able to simply be themselves and they try to be something different. They try to comply, they try to fit. That's where so much of the harm comes in. While you're thinking about your research and you're gathering information, are you finding, I don't know if this is a good way to put it, but sort of like the anti-wise, like what's keeping people from embracing this intersectionality? What's keeping people confused on these points? Are you finding anything about
Within the community, from a trans perspective at least, there's been numerous studies done. Almost all of the retransition rates are caused by external factors and societal pressures, medical pressures, therapy pressures. They're things that have nothing to do with their gender at all, and are actually tied into the fear of that loss. If I go through with this route to do whatever is necessary for my own personal welfare, then I'm going to end up alone and likely homeless and starving, because all of the familial and caring resources that I have around me aren't going to be there anymore. And when it comes to a lot of traumatized individuals, there's always that thought that even if these people around me are not the best kinds of people, even if they're abusive, without them, I'm alone. And that's worse. Even if that's not actually true, even if being on your own is going to be better, it doesn't feel that way when you're faced with that decision.
So that makes me think of a common mistake in identifying neurodivergence, especially autism, that we are antisocial, that we prefer our solitude, that we're not good at relationship, that maybe we shouldn't even be in intimate relationship. all kinds of what I believe are just super inaccurate and incredibly toxic ideas about the autistic community, most specifically. And if we take that and we place it in this realm of intersectionality with the queer community, um, I believe, though those of us who are autistic may need legitimate time to ourselves, we may need that sort of reboot space, right, where everything gets quiet and there are no requirements, and we need that time. I believe we are almost desperate for connection and relationship and community, but our sources for it are not healthy. It would be like dying of thirst and coming upon a rancid puddle. Drinking from it may dispel the thirst, but it's going to kill you, right? Like,
I get it.
so we may choose to separate from the social experiences that are available to us. That doesn't mean we don't crave connection, friends, intimate partnership. Like, it doesn't mean we don't have not only the desire for it, but a really unique ability to thrive in those situations and in those relationships. And if when it comes to the queer community, especially because it's 2022 and we still have a huge space where we are in part are fully closeted still.
All kept there. A third of transgender autistics were specifically denied their access to gender affirmation therapies, hormone replacement surgeries, etc., because they were autistic. And so they're questioned as to, oh, well, to what level can we believe them because they're autistic? Do they actually really know what any of that means? And that goes to a lot of damaging history of conflation of autism with other conditions, when being autistic actually plays no part in whether or not we can actually develop a sense of self and a sense of our identity, which is quite odd given that so much of the garbage research out there that says that we can't understand other people is because we're so involved in ourselves. So you'd think that if we knew anything, it'd be us.
Yes, exactly. Yes. The so my personal stand is that neurodivergent types are neurotypes, not types of disorders or disabilities. They can come with accompanying disorders and disabilities, but I also see a lot of that as societally imposed and not a natural state of being. And I see that the same for the queer community, because we have an imposed concept of quote unquote appropriate human behavior. We have legal definitions of a family. We have legal definitions of a marriage, and they are rooted in centuries old concepts. And willfully ignorant of the idea that it actually wasn't always that way. The Catholic Church married gay people back in, I think it stopped in the 1300s. Sorry for religious history people, correct me. I might not have the century right, but it hasn't always been that gay people were rejected. It hasn't always been that they were not allowed to be married. It has not always been the way it currently is.
Absolutely not.
We've just willfully shoved the history away and refused to consider that life in all of its forms comes in a huge variety. Like nowhere in life does it come in a binary. And we're even discovering things about single-celled animals that we didn't know before. We've had these limited ideas about even single-celled creatures that we're now learning aren't correct. So this idea that because we've done it that way validates anything ignores literal history and science.
Absolutely. The Sex and Sensibility video by Forrest Valkai, he goes by the handle the Renegade Science Teacher, and he picked apart the entire biological science. He's an evolutionary biologist on gender and the different sexes, and he explained it so well that when it comes to all of the different areas in the body and in the brain that actually make up what our sex is, yeah, you could be XY all male, you could be XX all female, in all of the different areas of your brain that dictate such things, in all of the different body parts that you have. But it is actually far more likely that you are going to be somewhere in between, because there's just so much genetic variation within humans. There have been discussions with professors who have explicitly given their students cell samples rather than having them use their own cell samples, because too many students figured out by studying their own chromosomes that the chromosomes they had didn't match the body parts they had, and they discovered they were intersex. And there was a tweet thread that she put out about it, saying that I can't do this anymore because finding out that these students are intersex in the middle of a 10-point assignment, just nobody has the time to deal with that. And it was causing too much pain, because the idea that all of these different genetic variations when it comes to human sex outside of the binary actually exists. That idea is so heavily rejected that the second that you find out you're not a part of something that you believe is a thing, it is almost damaging to your sense of identity, because you're told that everything you thought you were for so long was actually not true. And it goes to show that there's so much that we don't know about us. Like, unless you've had your entire brain and genome mapped out, you don't actually know what parts of you are what. And he put it so well. But when it comes to sexuality, like, none of it mattered. Like, the queerest history we have is ancient Rome and ancient Greece and ancient Egypt. Like, everyone was for everyone. There were no labels for different genders, different sexualities, because everyone was just a human. And if you were a sexual being, then they were attractive humans. That was all you needed to know. Concubines of all genders, your two-spirit peoples, your intersex shamans and priestesses in ancient civilizations, they were held as closer to the divine because they had parts of both sexes, and so they were valued as gods for their rarity. While now, just because it's not the average, well, it's a mutation, it's a problem, it's something that needs to be stopped. And it's like, where is your creativity? Like, the diversity of existence that we have here is the reason why we have the world we have.
Yeah. we're taught in so many ways to fear and reject difference. But it is the diversity in the natural environments. You're talking about flora and fauna and all of it. It is the diversity that helps everything survive. Sameness is rarely a thriving biosystem.
No, definitely not. If you don't have enough variation, then it only takes one environmental change to wipe out an entire species.
Yeah. And so the idea that in Western civilization anyways, we so highly value sameness. We line everybody up. We have everybody sit the same, stand the same, look the same, study the same. The sameness is valued basically above everything, but it is a complete denial of reality. And I think that's where our neurodivergent communities' heads explode. We're as creative and lovers of fantasy and science fiction. You guys see the dragon over your head, which I just absolutely am freaking out over. That is gorgeous.
Yes, that was a pre-ADHD medication impulse buy.
So worth it.
It absolutely was.
But as creative and imaginative and all of that as we can be as a community, I think we're trying to create the realities we see are possible, where the magical and mystical are not just part of the package, but they're accepted and valued. And I think we want, and again, this is a generalization, this isn't everybody, but we want a world where the differences aren't so startling and surprising, right? Like when we struggle with change, it's because something like leapt out of the shadows and scared us, not because we can't accept change, right? It's about the sort of violence of its arrival, not the fact that it is. And when we have a world that insists everything be exactly so, it creates too much space for the reality of difference and change and alternative to jump out of the shadows and complicate our world. Where if we had a world that was built on actually everything's always a little surprising, everything's, if you think about fantasy, right? Like all of a sudden you can be crossing a field and fairies start popping up, right? It's like, oh, what a cool world. I want to live in that world. But it would be a world where we expect fairies to pop up. We don't then turn and run in terror, right? So in that kind of thinking, in this research of intersectionality, did you have a sense of, I hope I find the whys that help validate the world I think exists and the world I want to exist?
I feel like that in exploring the research that exists, finding the gaps and sharing the why, if we can find any definitive reasons, that information is what changes the world. When we learn new things, that's how our world changes. Like less than a year ago, I was just a teacher. And one sentence put me on the path to start researching so I could get my ducks in a row, so I could come back at the chick that said that one sentence. And that led me to a specific TED Talk by Jack Den Houting, Why Everything You Know About Autism Is Wrong. And that video changed my life because I had never heard of the double empathy problem before. I never had understood why I was the way I was until 2 years before that, when I found out that I was autistic, and finally it made sense. But until the minute I watched that video, I still had never had the thought cross my mind that there wasn't something wrong with me. First, I didn't have the answer to what was wrong. Then I did have the answer to what was wrong, but I always still thought something was wrong until that video. And so when it comes to information, it changes how we see ourselves. It changes how we interact with and connect with other people. It changes how we navigate the world. It changes how we attempt to change the world. And so the more that we can get out there, then the more people know it, and the more they're able to pass that on, and that knowledge spreads. And we do what we can to get it as far as we can, to get it as ingrained as the mainstream misconceptions that have come before it. When it comes to the queer community and the neurodivergent community, we've been hand in hand since World War II. We were side by side in concentration camps. My deepest apologies if any Jewish viewers are upset by the mentioning. All I learned through school was that when the Jewish concentration camps were liberated, the Jewish people they managed to save got to go free. I never heard about the pink triangle for a decade after that. I didn't know that disabled people were sent there too for many years after that. And there's a reason for that, because when queer and autistic disabled people were sent to these camps, the disabled people were the first to go. We were of no use. We couldn't work, so they didn't keep us around. And given that homosexuality and any form of sexual deviance was still a crime at that time, then even when the camps were liberated, queer people were just sent from one prison to another. And there were none of us left alive to free. Then you have Lovaas, who developed applied behavioral analysis as a therapy for autistic children. Get my quote right here. Primitive psychotic children, in an attempt to rebuild us into real humans, and using the practices that he developed for applied behavioral analysis for autistics, he then got one of his students, George Reckers, and they then went on to use the same principles to develop gay conversion therapy. So this continuation has trans people and autistic people, or neurodivergents in general, we've always walked through history hand in hand. Jim Sinclair, 1993, Don't Mourn for Us, considered to be the trigger of the neurodiversity movement, the autistic rights movement. Z's himself is also trans. I didn't even know that until when I was doing this very research. I just thought he was a man, that Z was a man, and Z is not. And the more connections I looked for, the more I found, and it just kept going. The autistic rights movements going hand in hand with the transgender rights movements. Both of us are considered deviants in society who people have constantly fought to change us to fit the society they expect. Both pathologized as diseases, disordered, something requiring intervention. Both of us targeted to the point where it impacts well-being, leads to additional mental illnesses, depression, anxiety, traumas, PTSD. We also have similar home experiences in that when you have a birth family, parents tend to expect their children to be like them. So when you're an autistic born into a somewhat neurotypical family, or you're a queer person born into a cis hetero family, it's like, no, I don't want to use this comparison, but it's the only word I can think of right now. It's like you're an alien in your own home. Your entire existence is a culture shock because no one around you is like you and you're the one being made out to be a problem. But if you had a white family adopt a Japanese baby, they wouldn't be surprised if that child was growing up differently to what they expected. And that expectation of what you think your child should be is what really needs to change, because you never know who your children are going to be. And at the end of the day, if they're kind and decent, you give yourself a pat on the back and you go to your grave happy, because that should be the only goal outside of everything else. The queer and neurodivergent communities, we're often having ethics discarded when it comes to studies and research being done on us. Lovas and Rika's initial Feminine Boy Project study was done on a 5-year-old boy. And no assent from him was gained. There was no consideration as to whether or not he wanted to be there, something that still continues to this day for autistics in ABA. The way autistics are seen even now is that we have to earn our human rights. We have to behave as people consider humans to behave before we're considered human enough for consent to become an issue. And it's a frequent concern that's raised with many ABA papers within the autistic community. And even at the time that the Feminine Boy Project paper was released, Lovas and Rika's copped quite a lot of backlash as a result of that paper back then. And so that's just yet another connection between the queer and neurodivergent communities, where what queer community members have been through before them, us fighting for our rights as queer people, the autistic rights movements is mirroring that. And it's because their fight is a template for our own because of our shared history.
And I think that there is exceptional value to very broad knowledge about this topic. I think both communities are enormously benefited by understanding the abundance of crossover in our communities. It's not that, you know, we can be queer and concerned about our you know, neurodivergent fellows. It's that, oh yeah, that's probably us too, right? Or vice versa, you know, yes, of course I like my queer friends, but oh no, actually maybe we're one and the same. And that doesn't mean every autistic person is queer, and it doesn't mean every queer person is autistic or neurodivergent in some way, but it does mean that we live in the same neighborhood, right? So if the water's bad, it's bad for all of us. If, you know, if the streets aren't paved, they're not paved for any of us. To be able to know that our communities are so inextricably intertwined, I think, is information that allows us to consider our world in a way that is going to help us all move forward productively and progressively.
I think for a lot of us, it's the lack of consideration. Like, it's until I started researching this, the idea that I wasn't simply a woman wasn't a thought that I'd had, because the idea of gender is never something that crosses my mind. It is so far removed from everything I do, from everything I am, for everything I'm fighting for everything I spend my days doing, that who or what I was is just irrelevant to all of it. And when I was first exploring particularly the biological sex differences, to get my head around that, when I first watched the Forrest Valkai video, I thought, okay, well then what am I? And, well, gender roles don't count anymore, because, you know, societal change means that anybody can be anything. The job you have doesn't matter. The roles you take on at home doesn't matter. Child rearing or domestic duties don't matter. The hobbies you're into don't matter. When it comes to feminine versus masculine appearance, that's also been brought down by societal change, where the clothing you wear is simply an aesthetic choice. Forrest had successfully pulled apart my understanding of how biological sex may not even necessarily make a difference. And it certainly doesn't when it comes to gender, even outside of biological sex. And then transgender people existing as a group debunked a lot of, you know, what you're born as and the parts you have are what determine that. So it's like, if none of those things determine it, then what does? And so in order to figure out what I was, I had to ask myself, well, what makes a man? What makes a woman? And I had no answers. And then I was like, oh, I'm just going to put the lid back on that box. I'm going to put this box under this shelf, and I'm going to leave that there, because that's not a rabbit hole I have the time to be exploring right now. Just going to wrap it up in a tape with tape marked fragile. Caution, do not open. Please tape, do not cross. Going to ignore that, save it for another day. And it was thoughts that kept coming back. And to be fair, it's still not an answer I have. It's kind of like ADHD, activity cravings or autistic snack cravings. Like, I don't know what I want, but I know it's not that. So that's where I'm at gender-wise. Like, I don't know what I am, but I know it's not what people think I am. Because whatever that is, it's not that.
Yeah, being the mom of two non-binary kids and a third who's leaning in that direction, and thinking about, you know, what is gender and all of those things, and that allowing me to remember arguments with my parents about the use of they them. You know, I remember vividly being really horrified getting taught when I'm very little, these are your private parts and nobody touches them and you don't talk to people about them. And then being taught what she, her means and what he, him means. And I'm like, okay, I'm not supposed to talk about them, but every time I use a pronoun, I'm talking about them, so I don't know what to do. And just literally freaking out and being super uncomfortable and arguing, why can't I just use they, them? It's non-specific, right? And being told, well, that's plural. And no, it's not, because I can point to a single person that I don't know and I can say they or them. And my parents just having no idea what to do with me. And the argument got quiet because they didn't have anybody to argue with on my side, until gender started being a question for my kids. And I raised my kids with the idea that it doesn't matter what somebody zips up in their pants in terms of your attraction to them. Think more about the human. So sort of almost purposefully tried to raise bisexual human beings. I didn't want body parts to be the reason they cared about somebody, because that can lie to you. But then I started considering their own gender, and I started considering it, and I decided, oh, I don't know that I identify with the concept of non-binary exactly as it seems to be being presented right now, but I sure as hell am gender rejecting. I hate the concept entirely. Every last ounce of it, that your body parts dictate a social construct that was imagined by somebody else that didn't ask me if I liked it, and changes on you depending on your society, your church, your like it just, there's nothing legitimate about it. There's nothing fact-based about it. And I don't enjoy things that are not fact-based unless everyone agrees it's fantasy or fiction, right? To have to live a fiction as though it is truth goes against everything that I am. So gender rejecting just became my like badge of honor. I don't care how you perceive my presentation. You may not decide who I am based on that construct. So that's what I did with that box. I basically took it out in a field and blew it up. And I think it's a kind of amazing to watch my kids be able to feel free to think those things so much earlier than I did.
Well, that's the ultimate goal, isn't it? Everything
Yeah.
we're doing is all for the purpose of making a better world for them. Like, as cynical as it sounds, it's already too late for a lot of us. To be perfectly honest, I'm only 30 years old. I don't think I will live long enough to see the change that I want for the coming generations. But I do know that we are continuing to build the foundations that were started in the 90s, that one day it's going to happen. Like, I can see it in schools now. The entire culture is changing in schools. Kids are not what they used to be. They are not taking the power imbalance laying down. They're rejecting the ideas of the social structures where teachers, parents, principals, bosses are gods above them that they must blindly and obediently obey. I don't know what the future is going to look like, but I know it is going to be different in the future. It's a matter of when, not if.
Yeah, and I agree with you, and I think we need to steady and sturdy ourselves for the historically proven path of change. It is at first violently resisted. And so as we see, like we have in the United States, women's reproductive rights turning backwards on themselves, and books that have BIPOC main characters being banned, and the whole thing, right? We see this aggressive reaction to those of us who are standing up and being willing to be visible and in our own ways verbal, and refuse to sit down and be quiet anymore. We're gonna have a big reaction to that. And we need to continue to like breathe deeply and keep moving, because again, as history has shown, I mean, right now, gosh, again, historians, I'm so sorry if I'm getting this wrong. I think right now in Oklahoma, they're celebrating a particular race, anti-race sort of sit-in that happened, where Black people went to a lunch counter and sat, and they weren't served. So they came back the next day and they sat. And there were white customers that literally sat on them and ate their lunch. Coffee was spilled on them. They were treated like the floor and worse. But they continued to come back and back and back. And eventually it changed that lunch counter. Can you imagine being willing to attempt to survive all of that so that one place to get a meal would change? Forget society, right? We're going to go through all of that so that this establishment changes. Now, granted, because that establishment changed, it had a ripple effect. But if we are going to see the changes that you hope for and that I hope for, we are going to have to steady ourselves and be resilient in the face of rather extreme pushback. That fear that I mentioned in the beginning and asked you about was, in the United States, people are very afraid that it will empower organizations that are looking for the autistic piece of the genome so that they can clip it out so that people aren't autistic. And if they can attach gayness or transness to the autistic gene, that empowering them with C, if we could eradicate autism, there'd be no more trans people. And they can put it in this package of love and care, right? Because look at how hard it is for trans people. Right. Wouldn't we want to save them from it? And so, those are the conversations I'm having. The sort of terror that happens in somebody's eyes when they think about, okay, if this intersectionality is real, how will that be weaponized? And I think go ahead.
Well, me specifically, I look at the social intersectionality. So I'm talking about how these different aspects of our identity impact our social experience of being human in this world. I'm not participating in any genetic research, nor would I. It would fly in the face of everything we've been fighting for, particularly in the face of the Spectrum 10K studies under Baron Cohen in the UK currently. I am interested in biology, but only in so far of examining our neuronal connections in the brain. So I want to see what's happening in our brain when we stim. I want to see what's happening, what neural pathways are being used when we are working out new information. I want to see in our non-speaking autistics whether or not their neural pathways go through different areas in the brain other than the traditional language pathway we know of. Like, that's the biology that I'm looking at, the real answers that autistic people want to know, not just where did we come from and how do we get rid of them. Like, that will never be any focus of my research. And in regards to queer intersectionality specifically, the goal is to explore the why, so we can then translate that understanding into the real world. So you're not having autistic trans kids being denied their access as a non-autistic trans child would be, so that when it comes to adult care, it's breaking down further medical barriers that too many of us are already facing because we're autistic. It's to make sure that clinicians, therapists, doctors, teachers are able to understand the autistics, the queer people that they're working with, to make sure that the care they're providing is tailored to that person. So those are my goals.
And I love those goals, and I'm very interested and excited to see as your research continues to progress and what you come up with. And I'm just really grateful you were willing to share your journey with the Innis audience. I know we're going to do something again literally in just a few minutes. So if you're watching this video and you enjoy this conversation, Courtney and I are going to be talking about ADHD. So go watch that video too. But on this topic, Courtney, one, thank you for doing the research. Thank you for putting your time and effort and heart and passion into this really important topic. And thank you for sharing it here.
Thank you.